Christian faith is based on events that reverberate through history. Events that show God's character and God's power, definitely, but also events that change the realities, the possibilities of human life and living, change them forever. With the incarnation that we celebrate at Christmas, Jesus enters the world as a human baby, God's very self becoming one of us. With the cross, that perfect human life was crucified unjustly, paying the price for human sin, but bringing within our reach forgiveness and relationship with God. With the resurrection, the Father raised Jesus to renewed triumphant life and made eternity with him possible for all who follow Jesus. It's just good we've got a sound system I can actually be heard. Christian faith is based on events that reverberate through human history. And even though they're once and for all events, they change how we live. They change the realities, the possibilities of human life and living. They change them forever. For example, the incarnation doesn't need to be repeated, but it shows us that we have a high priest who knows what it's like to suffer and to be tempted. And that makes it possible, Hebrews 4:16 tells us, to approach God's throne confidently because we know we'll receive grace and find mercy to help us in our time of need. The cross doesn't need to be repeated, but it shows us that God cares about sin, shows us that sin matters, but also that he longs to deliver us from judgment, also shows us that God's love overrides the power of sin. As Paul says in Romans 5:14, but the gift is not like the trespass. For if the many died by the trespass of the one man, Adam, how much more did God's grace and the gift that came by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, overflow to the many? The cross doesn't need to be repeated, but we need to ask for its power to overflow into our lives day by day. Every time we confess, that's what we're asking to do. In that way, grace doesn't just reverberate through human history. Grace also reverberates through our daily lives. The resurrection doesn't need to be repeated. Death has no more dominion over the risen Jesus. But even more than that, we can know its power in our lives. As Romans 8:11 has it, for if the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his spirit who lives in you. So the spirit of resurrection lives in us. In that way, resurrection life reverberates through our daily lives. Pentecost is also one such event. It too is a once-for-all event, but it's also one that shows God's character and God's power, and it's also one that reverberates through history. It's also one that changes the realities, the possibilities of human life and living, changes them forever. Pentecost simply means the 50th day after the Passover. It was the first of the harvest festivals. It was the festival at which God's people brought the first fruits of their harvest, the very earliest part of the crop, as a sign of their thanksgiving and their prayer for the rest. So it marked the beginning of the harvest, not the end. But three ways in which Pentecost is both once and for all and reverberates through human history. First way, the Holy Spirit comes from outside. The Holy Spirit comes from outside. They'd been told by the risen Lord to stay in Jerusalem, to stay and wait to begin their mission until, as Luke 24:49 has it, they'd been clothed with power from on high. That gift of power through the Holy Spirit was seen as the key to their witness being effective. Acts 1:14 and 15 tell us that they prayed constantly between the ascension and the day of Pentecost. They were a group of about 120 believers. The apostolic band that had been together, if you look at the beginning of Luke 8, it definitely included a number of women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. So they went from saying goodbye to Jesus at his ascension straight into dedicated, passionate prayer that involved all of them, both men and women. And that prayer, we're told, continued until Pentecost came. So when the Holy Spirit comes, he comes into a context that has been prepared, nourished by dedicated, passionate prayer. And the Holy Spirit emphatically comes to them from outside. We're often told today to look within for sources of strength. But the Holy Spirit emphatically comes from outside to strengthen them. Luke stresses that the coming of the Spirit is unexpected. It's an interruption that comes shockingly, suddenly. They are all sitting around, maybe they're having a break from prayer, and then the Spirit comes with a mighty roar of wind. Verse 2. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. But this is inside the house. It's not coming through a window. But as you can't have the smallest sound without movement of air, we've got to conclude that they experience not just a noise, but a mighty rushing wind coming into their midst suddenly. Maybe even when they're having a break from praying, sitting around, at that moment, God comes into their midst. And not quietly, not gently. The Spirit doesn't steal into their midst. The Spirit erupts into their midst with the sound of a violent wind. The word violent is sometimes used of breaking and entering. Maybe that's why the Spirit chooses a moment to come when they are all seemingly sitting down. Maybe otherwise this forceful wind would have bowled them over. Now the wind symbolizes the breath and the power of God. We remember the breath that was breathed into Adam to bring life at creation. And remember the breath that's breathed into the disciples by Jesus at John 20:22. The mighty rushing wind symbolizes the breath and power of God coming to them. Doesn't just symbolize it, but brings it undeniably into their midst. The Holy Spirit comes from outside. Second way that Pentecost is both once and for all and also reverberates through human history. The Holy Spirit touches and fills them all. The Holy Spirit touches and fills them all. Verse 1, when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Now, there are two expressions in that phrase in the Greek which can both be translated together. So it's kind of together. They're in a place of utter unity. The mighty rushing wind fills the whole house where they were sitting. There isn't a part that's not filled with the presence and power of God. They're all together, and everyone was touched, battered even by this mighty rushing wind. So the Holy Spirit comes from outside and comes into the context of unity and touches them all together. What happens next is first a corporate experience before it becomes a personal one. It's a corporate consecration before a personal one. Verse 3, they saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. I think a single burning fire appears in their midst. And then that single burning fire divides into separate tongues of fire. And then each separate tongue of fire moves to come to rest on each one there. Remember that the Spirit who falls upon them is the Spirit of holiness. I'm sure you remember the angel bringing a burning coal from the altar in Isaiah 6 and 7. He brings it to cleanse Isaiah's lips to speak for God. I think we should see the flames that come and rest on each of them as the purifying, refining fire of the Spirit of holiness. It's a cleansing, it's a purification, which makes them then ready to receive the fullness of the Holy Spirit. but it happens to them all. It happens together and personally. They are all consecrated as one body. Once consecrated by refining fire, there's nothing left. Once consecrated by refining fire, there's nothing left to stop the Holy Spirit descending upon them, just as he descended on Jesus at his baptism. Verse 4, all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. It's the same word, filled, that Luke uses to describe the sound of the rushing wind filling the house. The Holy Spirit enters into each of them and fills them. Not until they had been consecrated does the Holy Spirit enter and fill them with his presence. It's a simple idea. It's not the easiest one to get our heads around. If we talk about somebody being filled with joy or with grief, the idea is simple, that this particular emotion has consumed them, that they are full of it. There's no part of them left over unfilled. You can't be a little bit joyful. The idea doesn't work. So there is a sense, I think, that we're filled with the Holy Spirit in a somewhat similar way, with no part of us left unfilled. But notice that it's an unquestionably physical metaphor. And I think it's a physical metaphor because it's a physical experience. Yes, of course, it also touches heart and mind, soul and spirit, but it's something that they experience bodily, physically. In Acts 10:44, Luke writes of the Holy Spirit falling on people, falling on them in a way that those around them could see what was happening and recognize it as the same thing that they'd already experienced. So we're talking about an experience that is physical and has observable effects. Even those disposed to ridicule what's going on in verse 13 can clearly see the effects of the Spirit's filling. Yes, they compare it to drunkenness, but such is the overwhelming character of the experience, it cannot be hidden from anyone. The Holy Spirit touches and fills them all. Third way, Pentecost is both once and for all and a reality that reverberates through human history. The Holy Spirit empowers worship and witness. The coming of the Spirit is the gift of a presence and a power emphatically comes to us from outside us. We're not discovering strength that we never knew we had. We're being given strength we never really had. We see that clearly in verse 4. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. I think we need to do a little bit of reconstruction to understand what happens here. We begin in what appears to be a private home. Verse 2 talks about the whole house where they were sitting. And yet by Acts 2:14, Peter is clearly outside and addressing a large crowd that's gathered. Gathered because they have been drawn by the ecstatic, joyful experience of the disciples. And yet Luke doesn't tell us how we get from being inside the house to being outside in a crowd. I think what happens is this. Second half of verse 4, began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. More literal translation would be, as the Spirit gave them to speak out. What are they speaking out? Verse 11, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. So when the Spirit falls upon them, they're enabled to start speaking God's praise in lots of different languages. And it seems, verse 6, that they do this loudly, joyfully, persistently. Loudly, joyfully, and persistently enough to cause people to stop and wonder. They are so filled with joy and with praise, they just can't contain it. And they start, I think, then to spill out into the street. Because when you are full of joy, it's bursting out of you. That explains the transition from a house into the street and to drawing a crowd. But notice, it isn't primarily mission, it's worship. They're not proclaiming God's wonders to the crowds. Rather, the crowds overhear them declaring God's wonders to God in praise and worship. The pouring out of the Spirit leads to praise and worship. It's not directed at the crowd. It's not a sermon. They're not sharing their faith. It's not directed at the crowd, but at the Lord who has done this extraordinary thing. They're released in praise and worship, using tongues that none of them knew, but which the crowds thronging Jerusalem for the festival were astonished to recognize as their own tongues. Galileans had rather a strong northern accent. That's why they comment on, but aren't all of these folk Galileans? So yes, it leads to witness, but the Spirit initially releases in them unfettered, joyful, ecstatic praise and worship. The Holy Spirit releases and empowers worship that then leads to witness. Christian faith is based on events that reveal God's character and God's power. Yes, the incarnation, the cross, and the resurrection are once and for all events, but they also reverberate through history. They change what's possible and what's real for human life and living, and they need to be reappropriated by us day by day, week by week. But Pentecost is another once-for-all event that also we need to lay hold of, that also reverberates through history. Shows us that the Holy Spirit comes decisively from outside. We're not discovering a strength we never knew we have. We're being given new strength by a presence who comes to us. Shows us that the Holy Spirit touches and fills everyone. None who are praying in that house will pass by. And it shows us that the Holy Spirit releases and empowers us for worship that will lead to witness. The presence and power of the Spirit gave them such delight that they were enabled to share the wonders of God with all of the nationalities who'd gathered for Pentecost. What does all this mean for us today? It challenges us first, I think, about the primacy of worship. About the primacy of worship. The very first thing that the Holy Spirit moved the consecrated disciples to do was to be lost in wonder and praise. The very first thing was to give themselves wholeheartedly to ecstatic, joyful worship. That was the Spirit's first priority when he filled the disciples to overflowing, for that overflowing to be redirected into praise. I find that inspiring but also challenging. There are always reasons why we don't make space for worship. Always reasons why we redefine worship as something other than encountering God in praise. And yet the very first thing the Holy Spirit moved the disciples to do was joyfully, wholeheartedly, unreservedly worship the Lord. Where have we lost the primacy of worship? Where have we allowed it to be squeezed out of our lives? Where has it become for us just one priority among many rather than the first? And one priority that sometimes gets dropped altogether. How willing are we to recapture? How willing are we to be recaptured by the primacy of worship that the Spirit set at Pentecost? It challenged us, second, to ask for corporate and personal consecration. To ask for corporate and personal consecration. It was the refining, purifying fire in their midst, the one that came as a single fire that then separated and touched them individually, that led to their being filled with the Spirit. The filling comes after the consecration. I'm not saying that it always has to be that way, but often consecration precedes filling. The Holy Spirit moves most powerfully and easily in an environment where there is a desire for holiness, a desire for God's name to be honored. If we remember Mark 6, 5 and 6, not even Jesus could do many miracles in Nazareth because of their unbelief and their lack of honor. To what extent will we seek that kind of consecration? Seek not just to be forgiven, but forgiveness to birth a desire for holiness in us, a pursuit of holiness. Dare we ask for corporate and personal consecration? Dare we ask to grow in the likeness of Christ? That's the kind of heart the Spirit loves. That's the kind of offering on which the Spirit loves to descend. It sometimes feels to me that we want the wonders and depths of God on 5 minutes a day, and we want the world to be changed without ever getting our hands dirty. Dare we ask for corporate and personal consecration? Are we willing to ask to grow in the likeness of Jesus? And it invites us, third, to pray for the Spirit's presence and power to be poured out afresh. Pentecost was a once-for-all event, but only in the sense that it began a new season of the Spirit's presence and power, a new season that began and has never ceased. This willingness to be poured out has never ceased from God's side. Yes, sometimes the church lacks heart and fervor. Yes, sometimes the church doesn't really want to be holy. And yes, sometimes we've closed our hearts and our doors to the Spirit's fire. But the Spirit has never stopped wanting to descend, never stopped wanting to come, never stopped wanting to inhabit his people's praises. The Spirit has very often been hungrier to come than the church has been to welcome him. Are we willing to pray for the Spirit's presence and power to be poured out upon us afresh? To pray for a renewed Pentecost? Just as much as we need a new sense of the incarnation, a new experience of the cross's power, a new breath of resurrection hope, so we also desperately need for the power and the presence of Pentecost to reverberate through our church's life again, through the life of the church in this nation again. Are we willing to be hungry enough to pray for that? Dare we become as hungry for the Spirit to descend as the Spirit is hungry to come?